together. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It is a blessing to be with you. I want you to meet me on Blue Sky, santitajackson.bsky.social, santitajackson.bsky.social, at Santita J, on X, and the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. So that's facebook.com/Santita Jackson and Friends. And of course, you can meet. Hey, Bernadette got there first. That's right. We're talking about. She's over on YouTube on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Let's talk about what is happening. Um, Not just in the Middle East. We've been talking about Iran and Israel and the United States. That certainly does bear watching and discussing. But you know what? I don't know about you, but I've been very concerned about how this story is being covered in corporate media in the United States. And I think you should be too, because we're not getting the full story. And we're seeing how biased our own news are toward one side and how biased against another side they are. That is to say, you would not know that we've not heard Iranian voices really talking about how they feel about what's happening and how they feel about the American intervention. We've not heard their voices. We've not really heard their story. We don't know that they are, for example, a BRICS nation, that they're allied really with the global South. We don't really know that they've signed a strategic partnership with Russia, just as Russia signed one with China. We don't know that. We don't really understand their geopolitical importance, not just to that part of the world, but to the whole world. When they threatened to cut off the Strait of Hormuz, which is the gateway to 20% of the world's oil, we got that ceasefire the next day. So think about that, everybody. But so much of how we feel and what we think about this is being shaped by our media. And do you know who our media are and how they're reporting this story? Of course, this brilliant young man who's with us, who's part of the family here, Bryce Greene. Of course, you can catch him on Substack, and fairness and accuracy in reporting. Fairness and accuracy in reporting. This is the headline. The New York Times gave the green light to Trump's Iran attack by treating it as a question of when. Everybody, you write, Bryce, in the wake of the U.S. supported Israeli attack on Iran, and days before the direct U.S. bombing that followed, the New York Times editorial board argued that America, quote, must not rush into a war against Iran, close quote. But they were speaking out of both sides of their mouth, Bryce. And I
Right.
think we need to be able to analyze that. As you said, the language was shifty. And they'd say one thing in the headline, and then as you read the article, they were saying something else. They were really giving cover to, I guess, to our government and to Israel. I mean, and so help me to understand what you found troubling about this reporting, and certainly noteworthy for all of us.
Right. Well, when you first hear a headline that says America must not rush into war against Iran, that can mean two things. It could mean that America should not go to war with Iran, or America should go to war with Iran, but should do it in a more slow and methodical way. This is the latter is what the New York Times meant. The Times has a history of supporting American wars and manufacturing consent for American policies, and this was
Wait a
really
minute,
no
and they
different.
even will lie to do it, right?
And will certainly lie and mislead and misdirect audiences away from what the substantive issues of the day are and onto narrow questions. And I think this article that the editorial board published right before Donald Trump uh, uh, engaged in direct U.S. bombing is indicative of that trend. By claiming that we should not rush into war with Iran, They're critiquing Trump by saying he's violating some standard or some policy in which going to war follows deliberation. The Trump didn't do that here, and of course went ahead and bombed. But the New York Times doesn't really have a problem with the Trump administration's bombing of Iran, only the timing. In fact, they repeat almost verbatim what the Trump administration and Netanyahu government's propaganda line is on why these bombs had to fall. Namely, they say that a nuclear armed Iran would make the world less safe and that it would destabilize the already volatile Middle East and it could imperil Israel's existence and encourage other nations to acquire their own nuclear weapons with far reaching geopolitical consequences. This is exactly what Trump and Netanyahu are saying. They said we have to bomb because Iran wants to get a nuclear weapon and they're close to getting a nuclear weapon, and if they get a nuclear weapon, then not only are they going to use it on Israel immediately, but they're also going to proliferate this material by giving it to, terrorist organizations who want to blow up the world. So this is what the New York Times says, uh, but it's not true, and it's based on the false premise, and it's also based on overt lies. The premise is that Iran is currently working to build a nuclear weapon. Now, to justify this, they cited the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which we have has a deep history that we can go into, collaborating with Israel on justifying this war. But the IAEA never said that Iran is building a nuclear weapon or is even trying to build a nuclear weapon. The IAEA mentioned that Iran was violating its obligations under a treaty, or it alleged that Iran is violating its obligations under a treaty based on activity from over 2 decades ago. And this report coming to the forefront right now really has nothing to do with Iranian current intentions or capabilities at all. But the New York Times cited it as reason to believe that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. The United States intelligence agencies have repeated for quite some time that they have no evidence that Iran is building a nuclear weapon or that Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon or has even made the decision to build one. Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's director of national intelligence, made similar claims during her confirmation hearing and during in recent months. But like the Trump administration, she turned her tune to again claim that there is evidence that Israel or that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. Similar to the way Colin Powell lied on behalf of the Bush administration to claim that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction. We all remember that infamous picture of him holding up fake anthrax, which again turned out to be completely and totally fabricated. So the New York Times is promoting this idea in order to justify why we should go to war, while again saying that we might not want to rush into the decision. So this is really dangerous language from the top paper in the country to be able to use weasel words and fabricate justifications for what is clearly an illegal and dangerous and de-escalating and destabilizing act of aggression against a sovereign country. That's the best way to describe what Trump did against Iran.
So when you look at what, I mean, how would you grade the media, and just generally speaking, as you look at, as you watch television, as you read uh, other outlets, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are outlets uh, with which we have the with which we can that we can access most quickly. Can you critique what we're seeing? Because we hear Iran mentioned, but they're not being studied, right? We're not talking to Iranian people. I mean, they talk about regime change. We can get into that in a minute. Um, but they're pivoting to the Shah's son, who of course is based here in the United States. So tell me, I mean, they're not talking to other voices there. And They're not even looking at the fact that there's been a rallying around the flag, if you will, in Iran. They mention that and they gloss over that and then they move on. In other words, we're getting a very incomplete picture.
And
Right.
you're absolutely right. If we look back at war coverage in the lead up to the war with Iraq, there was all this commentary and discussion about how Americans would be greeted like liberators once they took out Saddam, that Saddam's regime was so awful and terrible that it could only be better for the Iraqi people. This turned out to be just pure insanity. Of course, we utilized chemical munitions on civilian populations, saturation bombing, setting up checkpoints, just a brutal military occupation for the better part of a decade. And this uh, was widely recognized very quickly afterwards to be a disaster, even if it did continue for years and years afterwards. But the fact that it was considered a disaster doesn't mean that American media learned much from it, because we're seeing the same kinds of coverage today. You mentioned the son of the Shah. The Shah was the Shah means king. It was the monarch of Iran that was installed after the U.S. overthrew the government of Iran in 1956 at the behest of American and British oil companies. After they overthrew the government, they installed the Shah and it supported a military dictatorship that was a brutal surveillance state for this population that lasted for 2 decades until it was overthrown by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which gave birth to the Islamic Republic of Iran that we see today, and that's the same. It's the same government that's been governing. And this idea that by blowing up this regime and fracturing a very complex, highly industrialized, and a relatively modern society, the idea that blowing that up and decapitating the regime would be, sunshine and unicorns is a very dangerous point of view. But you don't really see that critique in the U.S. media. You hear a lot of triumphalism about how important it is for America to go help Iranian women, but the tacit assumption of that coverage is that the best way we can help Iranian women is to bomb the hell out of their country and take over their government and replace it with a government that is subject to American, Western, and Israeli interests. This doesn't make the world better for people. I mean, blowing up a country is, a policy of mass murder, even if it's direct or indirect. But the policy isn't being talked about like that. Now, I should note that the Trump administration has made overtures, and the Israelis have made overtures to the idea of a long term regime change operation being done in
Mhm.
Iran. But as of a few hours ago, it seems that both sides have agreed to a ceasefire, which may or may not be true. The reporting is always complicated on this, but it seems that a ceasefire has been reached uh, for a number of reasons. Iran and Israel have expended a lot of resources in training their missile fire, and Israel certainly can't continue their attacks on Iran if the United States isn't on board. And there is some indication, despite earlier deception operations, that there is some sort of division, some degree of division between the U.S. and Israelis. Now, I don't want to overemphasize that because, again, a gap between Trump and Netanyahu was strategically used by the Israelis to uh, throw the Iranians off guard
Mhm.
and allow for a surprise attack to be even more surprising. So I
Hold
think,
on,
but
because one has to wonder just how authentic that has been. Be-
right,
because he also has Netanyahu acolytes all around him. I mean, basically, they give him their talking points.
right.
So they might have a personal disagreement, but not a philosophical one.
Right, and none of these people, none of these people working in Washington are insulated from the influence of the Israeli lobby. I mean, the Israel lobby is probably one of the most powerful organized lobby groups in America today, and they, work with both Republicans and Democrats, and they operate at nearly all levels of society, from inside of the White House to your local public school, which might have some uh, engagement with the Anti Defamation League to uh, propagandize young people about the virtues and shared values that America has with Israel, and how Israel's a defense against anti-Semitism. This is a persistent problem within American politics, and Trump is certainly no stranger to that. This idea that he would be wholly opposed to this Zionist and imperialist project, it doesn't seem to hold water. But these personal disagreements, they might be something substantial. Every presidency since JFK was killed, they've had moments where the state of Israel has done something outrageous and egregious, and officials publicly and privately expressed some concern. And Trump's recent outburst, I believe it was this morning,
Yeah.
it's been a long day, about Iranians and Israelis not knowing what the F they're doing. That could be part of more an entrenched deception operation, but it could also be a very genuine uh, expression of distaste and concern that the Israelis are acting outside of what the U.S. is dictating. In any case, the escalation hasn't continued, and it has had a hopefully permanent but more likely temporary pause. Uh, this means that regime change is now less likely to be the outcome, as many of us were expecting, and many analysts across the political spectrum were expecting. Um, but that doesn't mean that the danger is over. There are certainly people within the administration, certainly people in Israel, who are foaming at the mouth for a chance to attack Iran, for a chance to remake Iran and the Middle East in general in the image of the West. One of the overriding strategic objectives for the United States and Israel in the Middle East is to take out any peer or near peer competitor that could challenge the American Israeli dominance of the region. The Gulf Arab states, they're just in it for the money, but the axis of resistance, represented by Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the Iranian government, and until December, the Syrian government, well, they have an interest in maintaining their regional sovereignty outside of the influence of this Western imperialist system. And that's a major threat to U.S. interest. In the 1990s, the Netanyahu uh, Richard Pearl neocon nexus came out with a paper called The Clean Break, which laid out this strategy in pretty striking detail. The need to overthrow and take out any country that could threaten American dominance in the world and the Middle East, especially. This document, you can read it today, isn't talked about a lot, but it's, the people who wrote it and the people who adhered to those beliefs, they obviously haven't changed their beliefs over time. And they've been utilizing their American political power and the shock of various crises to advance that goal. The shock of 9/11, of course, allowed the American empire to go into Afghanistan and invade. They tried to go to Iraq immediately after 9/11, but that had to wait until 2003, where another propaganda blitz allowed America to go to war. And then this, was a quagmire, but that didn't stop the U.S. from bombing Libya in 2011 under Obama. And there were talks about going into Syria in 2012 through 14 during the Syrian uh, civil war that the U.S. instigated by funding some of the jihadi rebels. Uh, Luckily, the Syrian engagement didn't go that far, but this is still part of a long-standing plan from people who want to dominate the Middle East. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. They were all part of a list of countries that were targeted for overthrow by the U.S. government in the wake of 9/11, as we heard from General Wesley Clark, who reported on seeing memos to this effect. So that plan ended with Iran. Destroying Iran and regime changing Iran was the crown jewel of the neocon vision for the Middle East, and it remains to be so. Just look at the people around Donald Trump. A lot of them are neocons, although some of them from the Bush administration, some of them work at these hawkish think tanks, and a lot of them are, dyed in the wool American imperialists. While there are some, especially in Trump's base, who resist these trends and criticize these trends, the overriding force of American foreign policy establishment is geared towards expansionism and war.
But hold
And
on, hold that thought. Stay right there, because politically, it seems that I'm wondering if President Trump is the captain of his ship or is the captive of it, because you have a real disagreement that you're beginning to see manifest, or should I say, come forward through Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey, and others. I think that the fact that they have not moved might be emboldening others to come forward. And wait a minute, to be in step with their constituents, Bryce Greene, because Americans don't want to go to war. They don't want to put their boots on the ground. They don't want that. And yet the media are, I'm wondering about the political fallout, because I think they're making it about the personalities, which they always do, but they're not doing the man on the street interviews, so you can talk to people and hear what they're thinking and what they're saying. I mean, I hear that on Washington Journal on C-SPAN in the morning. Bryce. I mean, so,
it's a good question whether or not Trump is the captain or a captive. Now, if we look at the American political system, presidents are not selected to run for president, to be a viable candidate, because they go against the grain of the general political system. Occasionally you get a Bernie Sanders type, or today Zoran Mondani type, or Mamdani type, but the most people who end up in the political system are there because someone in the upper echelons of the American power elite feel that they can utilize this individual, this candidate, for their own ends. Just reading a book about Jimmy Carter and his presidency, and it goes into how Carter was selected by the Atlanta establishment as someone who could implement the Atlanta establishment's policies. They put him in touch with the Eastern establishment in New York and D.C., who also were convinced that Carter could implement his policies, and that included the media establishments, who gave him a lot of coverage, which boosted his poll numbers, and eventually brought him into the presidency.
well, hold
And
it.
when
Let's go back, because he is from the Naval Academy.
right,
You know,
and
so it's someone who's kind of been in their sight line, who was in their sight line since he was a kid, basically.
right, and for all the talk of him being like a small peanut farmer or whatever, he was part of the descendants of wealthy plantation owners,
Mm.
and his peanut farm wasn't a mom and pop operation. It was effectively a plantation. And so he was cultivated by the system, and he was selected by the system because they felt that he could implement their policies.
Hmm.
In the 2016 election for Donald Trump, there was a lot of doubt and confusion about whether or not Trump would genuinely be able to implement a policy that was contrary to, or that was as friendly to the elites as your Rick Santorum or your Ted Cruz or whoever would be, because Trump was talking a major game about the need to get out of all these foreign entanglements,
Yeah.
the folly of America's political parties in addressing the real issues of the system. He talked a major game about that, and some people were actually worried. It wasn't until it was very clear that he was the nominee and that he was popular and that he had a choice that all of the elites came and or all of that elite class came and supported him for his presidency. But once that became the case, Donald Trump had constituencies to manage. And there were a lot of hawkish constituencies, and there were a lot of more nationalist, more isolationist constituencies. And they did battle within his administration. It's how you get people like Steve Bannon to be a special advisor to the president, who is definitely America first and against a lot of these foreign wars. And you also have Trump ended up appointing John Bolton, who was one of the original members of the Project for a New American Century, which shaped the Bush administration's policies. Those two trends were dueling within the first Trump administration, the same way they're dueling in this administration, the second Trump administration. Uh, to what extent Trump has any guiding principles, it's win and remain popular. So he's actually at the mercy of whatever tendencies his advisors are sending him, or whatever justifications that his political advisors, his military advisors are all sending them, and he's trying to, uh, I guess, thread that needle in order to maintain his own political viability. In this case, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Steve Bannons, the Thomas Masseys, they're all very against this war that Trump is was on the verge of starting. It was certainly escalated the tensions there. But a sizable chunk of his base isn't represented by the major chorus of Republicans calling for war. If we look at the resolution, the War Powers resolution presented by Thomas Massey and some others, uh, Republicans are not signing on to this. Some Democrats are. A lot of them aren't. The majority aren't. But very few Republicans are. And that's because, again, these Republicans are captured by these same hawkish forces. Now, the anti war tendency in the country is important, and the Masseys and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes are voicing what appears to be a very a majority of the population. I think recent polls came out showed that 57% of the country disapproved of Trump's striking of Iranian facilities, and that number is almost guaranteed to go up if you ask questions about do you approve or disapprove of sending troops on the ground or a long-term engagement. The American public doesn't really like that, but the American public isn't really represented by Congress, by policymakers, by the think tanks, and by the people who shape American foreign policy. So this populist tendency to avoid war is dueling with this elite tendency to advance or promote war. And the Trump administration, for now, seems to be moving in the more populist direction. But again, there's no reason to
Are
believe
they
that the neocons
moving?
have been excised.
Are they moving or are they being pulled in the
Well,
populist direction?
it's a little bit of both. I mean, the anti-war base was already there, and it was already
Mhm.
well known. And it appears that part of the Trump disinformation or the Trump deception operation on the strikes with Iran was in part to shield Trump from his base. And Trump told the news media that he always knew the date of Israel's attack on Iran. If that's true, then the negotiation stuff was not only a smokescreen for Iran, but as a smokescreen for his base. And you can go and look at some of the right wing commentators who are very pro Trump and will follow Trump on anything, try and justify Trump's actions by saying, no, Trump is genuinely looking out for negotiations. Look, and then when that turned out to be false, they pivoted instantly and said, well, it's the art of the deal. Trump knows what he's doing. But there are others who, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are very vocal against this, and they're being attacked by other members of Trump World, by
Mhm.
Laura Loomer and all those other weird Trump swamp monster type people. Uh, but they're being attacked, and so
Well, it
that
seems like it's a fight. I mean, there is a fight, and because I was reading one report, and his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, is only letting the war hawks in to speak to Trump. Um, so to President Trump, excuse me. So there's that. But then you've got this other player, the New York Times, right? The corporate media, who are only giving one point of view, right? And it seems that Trump, if the president leaves the reservation, if you will, that's when they assail him. I mean, they're at odds with with where the American public are, and they didn't even bother telling us the truth about what the intelligence agencies. Tulsi Gabbard was not an outlier. She is the head of She's the director of national intelligence. She said, "This is what we found," which is they're not trying to build a nuclear bomb. That's not what they're trying to do. But I didn't see them take the time to really explain her position. I mean, they've just written her off as a conspiracy theorist and they kind of let her float off into the ether. Bryce Greene.
Oh,
And so, I
right.
mean, so my question is, I mean, this is such a consequential time. Who do we trust?
Well, certainly, one of the heartening aspects of this entire conflict is that there are loads more alternative and non-traditional media sites that people are getting their news from and that are shaping opinions and that are a venue to reflect the interests of the general public over the interest of elites. Media is very easily captured by elites. I mean, media are the elites. The New York Times, the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, CNN, a part of the major international conglomerates. Disney owns, a good chunk of the media that people see. These are elites, and they have an interest in promoting the prerogatives and the interest of the major corporations and the banks and hedge funds and defense contractors uh, that are them. I mean, it's not that they answer to these people; it's that they are these people.
Mm-hmm.
But the new media ecosystem, the podcast, the YouTube shows, alternative radio, alternative magazines, and newspapers, well, they have made their voice heard a lot this past week of run up
Mm-hmm.
to war, because people like that are now representing a more political base. You can't just rely on CNN, CBS, ABC, and Fox to make your point and to sell whatever position you have to the public. You also need to get through to the people who watch, the Joe Rogans, or on the other side, the Jimmy Dores and the majority reports, all those people who are outside of the traditional boundaries of mainstream. And it's a lot easier for them to just say what the public's thinking about war. And it's a lot easier for them to translate that into some degree of political power. And so, while the overall disposition of the American elite hasn't changed, they're certainly more aware of this tendency. And the Trump administration, especially, which relies on that alternative media infrastructure to a significant degree for its political base, uh, well, they have to take that into account. They have to take that into account when they're thinking about Trump's future legacy. They have to take that into account when they're thinking about who are going to be running on Trump's coattails for the future. It's all an important game, but certainly it doesn't mean that the risk of war and the risk of greater intervention and the risk of imperial expansion has disappeared.
What question should we be asking now? Because it seems that we have such short historical memories, such historical memory and memories. Um, you saw how President Trump pivoted away from President Obama's Iran deal. Do you think that President Obama's Iran deal has been adequately explained? Um, and have is that the media's job to explain it? And should they explain why, or even ask President Trump, particularly now, why he made the pivot away from that deal?
Right, and this is one of the issues that I discussed in the article critiquing the New York
Yeah.
Times coverage. That the New York Times talks about the importance of getting Iran back to the negotiating table. And they gave a pros and cons list for going to war, and their cons list was that the Trump administration might well be able to achieve a stricter Iran deal today, stricter than the one under Obama. Well, the New York Times is acting like that is one of Trump's goals, is that that's what Trump wants to do. When very clearly, at least when this piece was written, that was not what Trump wanted to do. When the Obama administration put together the Iran deal, that was actually one of the more positive achievements of disastrous and overall disastrous foreign policy that saw the destruction of Libya, Syria, overthrowing the Ukrainian government, setting the stage for the Russian Ukrainian war. Lots of disasters. But the Iran nuclear deal actually removed one of the looming catastrophes, a general war in the Middle East out of the realm of possibility, or at least probability. What Trump did immediately into coming to office was to unilaterally withdraw from that deal, to say that, based on lies, of course, say that Iran wasn't compliant, despite the IAEA and U.S. intelligence saying that they were. But this was one of those uh, bravado moves that Trump did in order to say that I'm undoing Obama's legacy. And I'm sure he didn't really have any clue of the actual consequences of that. But it's something that the Israeli lobby and the neocons and the imperial expansionists were very happy to see. They were happy to see a new flashpoint open and the road to conflict with Iran sort of clear up under Trump. And so he refused to negotiate a new deal with Iran. And in 2020, if you'll recall, he actually assassinated one of Iran's top generals, which was a major act of aggression, terrorism, international law violations, what have you. This isn't a man who was seeking to find peace. Under the Biden administration, he campaigned on rejoining the Iran deal, but when the Iranians came to the table and offered a full resumption of all the deal, all the terms and conditions, and they would maintain compliance, the Biden administration rejected this and instead tried to impose new obligations and restrictions on Iran. Naturally, as the Biden administration got itself enmeshed in wars like Ukraine and Gaza, the Iran issue fell off of their platform. But he never really seriously wanted to rejoin the deal. Otherwise, he would have done it instantly. And that brings us back to Trump 2.0. In earlier this year, there was talk of negotiations with Iran, but we know that Trump had very little interest in that, and he dragged out negotiations in order to give Israel time to prepare their attack. And by some reports, the Israeli attack had been planned, and many of the accompanying Mossad operations had been planned for 8 months prior to the attack. So that takes us back to December, November of last year. There's some indication that Trump was well aware of Israeli goals because otherwise, why would he be engaging in this deception operation? Why would there be all these stories that turn out to be false about a major divide between Netanyahu and Trump? So I believe that there was some degree of foreknowledge that Israel was going to attack Iran,
But
and even if there wasn't, that is Israel's, one of their prime directives.
but it's fairly obvious that they had foreknowledge. Um,
You're right. It's only a
but
question of how much and when do they know, which probably will
well,
never get answered satisfactorily.
which goes into deniability,
Right.
right? Okay, which so there's some things I don't need to know, so technically I can say I didn't know. But now
Exactly.
we're on the precipice of nuclear war, and I don't think that's being adequately explained. I have to read many different publications. Bryce Greene and everyone, I want you to go to his Substack and of course follow him when he is published regularly on fairness and accuracy in reporting. They have such tremendous work, and that's where I met this young man. What I'm not seeing someone trying to talk to the former prime minister and president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who said, you know what? People could give them some nukes, right? We do know some countries who want to give them to Iran. Why isn't anyone exploring that? I think that's something I want to know. Even though he dialed that back, don't you think that's something that you need to talk to him about? Like, okay, well, who? Uh, why do they want to give Iran the nukes? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? I think
It appears that
the
the
questions are not being asked here that I
right.
think are worthy of exploration because one of I guess where I am is this: Iran is not they're not alone. There is a whole world out here who are actually on their side, Bryce.
Exactly, and the comment that Medvedev made about other countries giving Iran nukes, it was There was a lot of shock and kind of disgust at this comment, and he later clarified that he didn't mean that Russia would be giving it. He
Hmm.
meant that there are other countries that aren't party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, namely Pakistan, which explicitly reportedly offered to invite Iran under its nuclear umbrella. The This is a serious escalation, and this is a serious sign that the world is no longer going to be able to take America and Israel's reign of supremacy over the world.
Hmm.
If other countries are willing to come to the defense of international war or international law when it comes to attacks on Iran, well, that undermines the entire U.S. policy of constantly flouting and making a mockery of international law. Uh, if Iran is no longer a defenseless country, and there are other countries who say that they would come to their defense with nuclear power if needed, well, then that means that Israel's much less likely to attack it. This is part and parcel of some of the major developments happening in the world, in which countries are coming together and saying that we no longer want to live in a system in which the U.S. rules and dictates, but want to live in what's called a multipolar world, where multiple spheres of power and multiple poles of political power all over the world balance off of each other. This is uh, the central role of the BRICS bloc in global politics. We were talking about BRICS, quite a bit
Yeah.
in the first few months of this administration. Trump was sanctioning BRICS countries who were planning to go off the dollar or whatever he was talking about. But I think that conversation needed to be expanded and engaged a little bit more deeply because this is the dominant global force that we're seeing as a challenge to American hegemony. We're seeing China be able to invest in countries all around the world,
Hmm.
uh, be able to and be able to make all these deals with third world countries that are able to increase their ability to trade and develop and all of these useful things. It's being hailed as an alternative to what the U.S. and Western system of development is, in which they empower a small group of local elites to change the government's policies to be politically more favorable to Washington. This new system that's being developed isn't about that. It's about mutual gain and uh, a genuine vision of free trade. So America's attack on Iran and Israel's attack on Iran is an attempt to strangle this new world in the cradle before it can truly be born. And in fact, that's what America's foreign policy is all about. If you go read about why they wanted to uh, focus so much on China, why they want to increase tensions with China by stationing more troops in Taiwan and flouting U.S. policy of one China. The reason they do this is because they want to provoke China to overextend it so that it's unable to adequately defend its own interests in the face of American aggression. The problem is that that's not working very well, and U.S. Military planners and U.S. empire planners aren't really having they don't have a solution for that. While China is building up its defenses, America is still planning, and American generals have said that they're planning for war within a few years against China. Uh, while that's all happening, China's saying that we should be adhering to a system of international law. We should be adhering to something more stable, and really charging ahead in the face of American aggression. But this global conflict between East and West, between a West that wants to dominate and an East that uh, wasn't doesn't want to be dominated, and they don't necessarily themselves want to dominate. This global conflict shapes everything that happens in foreign policy. It shapes U.S. policy towards Russia. Well, Trump said explicitly that if we want to counter China, we have to knock out Russia, or at least get them to a point where they're feeling less chummy and less friendly with China. It's called the classic divide and conquer strategy.
Yeah, but
U.S. policy all over with these third world countries, especially the ones in Southeast Asia, is to get them on the U.S. side, entice them with IMF loans and what have you, to allow them to build U.S. military bases for the eventual war with China.
but
It's what's
but but
going on
but
in the
but but
Philippines. It's what's going on in
But Bryce, do they not know that the clock is ticking down on that? More and more. Look at what's happening in the Sahel, in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, and they're not alone. You have more and more the colonized are rising up against the colonizers. I
Right.
mean, that's the zeitgeist. It's the spirit of the times. That's what's happening.
This clock that you're talking about being ticking, I think it's really at the forefront of these hawkish planners' minds.
Oh,
If you are dedicated to American imperial hegemony, and you're dedicated to this vision of a greater Israel, and if you're dedicated to, global domination, you are acutely aware of the growing power imbalance between the U.S. and its rivals. Back in the 90s, during the unipolar moment, as it was called, there was no country that could conceivably stand against or challenge the United States when it, wanted to break up and destroy Yugoslavia for fun, when it wanted to blow up Afghanistan and Iraq, when it was doing all of these horrible things. There was no country that could credibly resist that. That changed a lot in 2014-15 when a resurgent Russia stopped American intervention in Syria and defended the Assad regime against the Contras that were being funded by the Saudis, Turkish, and Americans. Uh, Fast forward to now, those forces are even stronger. China, which the U.S. and the West thought would be integrated into the capitalist system after the reforms of the late 70s or mid 80s, actually turned out not to be a capitalist stooge country, but actually a well developed, communist society that was able to restrain the excesses of capital and is able to prevent the creation of a capitalist class. That capitalist class in the West is the driving force behind the aggressive policies. Without that internal logic, well, China has a lot more options and a lot more opportunities to develop peacefully, and that is precisely what they're doing. But the West is, they realize that this peaceful development is a lot more appealing to third world and people who are growing up in these turbulent times, and they're really realizing that America has a very limited time when it's able to exercise power anything like it was able to in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so that awareness might prompt them to, in a perfect world, it would prompt them to think about a soft landing from empire. Start thinking about winding this whole project down, behaving like a normal country, being a good neighbor to all the peoples of the world. But what's more likely is that they're growing more and more desperate, and that they realize that only a Hail Mary will be able to save America. Well, when that Hail Mary turns out to be an invasion of a major country, or in Biden's case, that Hail Mary was provoking a war with Russia in Europe. I mean, this situation can get very dangerous. It's a kind of a cliche at this point, but everyone knows that a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind of animal. And if the U.S. feels like its power is slipping, and only a major global tension would set the stage for the U.S. to be able to seize its former power, well, then we can expect that there are plenty of thinkers and plenty of policymakers who are thinking that way as well.
well, as we begin to wind things down here, that brings us to the paper of record. I mean, as you put it, the New York Times, in many respects, is probably the most consequential newspaper in the world at this time. At this time. I repeat, at this time.
Right.
Because things are changing. And I think that if they want to be at least a paper of consequence, they need to tell the truth. And they need to speak to more than this narrow imperial. They can't just be a voice for that. I mean, the biggest new television network in the United States is now YouTube, right? People are they are looking around and they're looking for other answers, and they're not looking at the times. And they're less and less trusted all the time. I mean, you can't just let the administration come after their director of national intelligence and not do a full review of that. She's the director of national intelligence, Bryce Greene, and she has said to you, at least until someone twisted her arm behind her back, no, they're not trying to have a nuclear bomb. They're enriching uranium because there are many uses, many uses for nuclear power, and that's what they're trying to do. But no one, but I haven't seen the New York Times do that. I've not seen them have, really fulsome discussions about these issues. I mean, we are on the verge of, these people are talking about using nuclear weapons, like some of us to eat jelly beans or M&Ms or whatever it is that you're into. They're talking life and death issues. So, I mean, well, kill and be killed issues so casually. Shouldn't we expect more from our newspapers and from our media from this particular state?
No, we absolutely should. Traditionally the media has seen themselves as a check on power, as an opposition to the powers that be on behalf of the general public. And, in a lot of respects, they do play that role, but only within a very narrow bound. The New York Times, and as I mentioned earlier, most of the other major media, are reflective and deeply integrated into the imperial system, into the corporatocracy, into all these the banks and major corporations and commercial enterprises that really dominate policymaking, that fund the campaigns, that decide who gets the money and decide what the Democratic Party is going to do or what the Republican Party is going to do. The media are a part of that system, and so when they do go after the politicians or the power establishment, it's only within a very narrow bounds. They're not criticizing the excesses of deep political power. They're not criticizing the covert intelligence agencies that basically run unchecked all around the world, doing God knows what. They don't cover the intense corporate influence in our government and our media, and how that's a problem and destroying what's left of the American dream. They talk about it a little bit, and they might offer band-aid solutions, but it's certainly not an issue that they care about. And one thing that that they're not going to care about, or that they're that is outside of the boundaries of the vibrant discussions that they have, is the issue of war and peace. No one is questioning America's right to go over, the other side of the world and bomb a country that's doing nothing to threaten it. No one is challenging the American imperial system. No one's challenging the legitimacy of America's overthrow of dozens of governments, the dominance of the IMF and reshaping governments in America's image. And no one's covering that in any serious way. Because these corporations that generate this media coverage are part of this system.
Well, they are trusted less and less and less and less, and
As they should be.
as they should be. Well, you know what? I'm not complaining because you know, that means that I think that people are growing up in our politics, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Is there anything you'd like to? Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we go?
Well, I'd like to encourage people to keep checking out alternative media, to keep reading places like Common Dreams, Consortium News, to keep looking at alternative voices, to especially check out Medea Benjamin's recent piece, which, I guess we ran out of time to discuss in detail. But
Oh,
it's about how the IAEA was utilized by the Americans and Israelis to essentially provide a justification, at least publicly, for war against Iran.
we'll talk
It's a
about that
very
in the
good
morning.
piece, and you can follow me and my work at Fairness and
Mhm.
Accuracy in Reporting, and you can follow me on Twitter at the Green BJ, and you can follow me on Substack under Bryce Greene's newsletter.
Well, I tell you what, we're going to be talking about the IAEA piece tomorrow morning, not with Medea Benjamin, but with Nicholas Davis, who
Oh,
co-wrote the
excellent.
piece with her. And so if you want to join, you're more than welcome. But to hear about that, that's very important, everybody. These are stories that are of tremendous consequence. And you need to know. You need to know exactly what is going on because our lives depend upon it. They really do. Follow Bryce Greene, everybody. He's absolutely brilliant. And I'm so glad that you were with us today.
I appreciate you having me on.
Always, always. Bryce Greene, everybody. Soon to be Dr. Greene. I cannot wait. I cannot wait. Hey, everybody. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I'm Santita Jackson. God bless you, everybody.